They said the old soldier had finally lost his mind. The summer, he started cutting down perfectly good trees around his property. Until the night the wildfire jumped the ridge, and the only house still standing belonged to the man they swore was destroying the mountain. In the rolling foothills west of Cranbrook, British Columbia, tucked between the Purcell Mountains and a winding stretch of the Kootenay River, the small town of Alderton had spent 100 years minding its own business. It was the kind of place where everyone recognized every truck on the road, where the general store still ran a tab for regulars, and where summer evenings stretched so long that people forgot the dark was coming at all. And above the town, on a wide plateau carved into the mountainside, a retired soldier named Malcolm Tate had been tearing up the land for months. Every morning, the people of Alderton could hear the chainsaw. The sound echoed down from the plateau like a mechanical heartbeat, bouncing off the valley walls and drifting over the rooftops. From the parking lot of the co-op, you could see the damage. Whole sections of forest that had once covered the slope were gone, stripped bare, stumps and raw earth where tall Douglas fir and lodgepole pine had stood for decades. In their place, Malcolm Tate had built something strange. The house itself was not large. A low, wide structure made of concrete block and heavy timber, with a metal roof that reflected the sunlight like a signal mirror. Around it, in every direction, stretched a cleared perimeter nearly 60 meters wide. No trees, no brush. Just gravel, bare soil, and a series of buried water lines that ran from a storage cistern he had built behind the house. Sprinkler heads poked out of the ground at regular intervals like tiny sentries. People in Alderton talked about it constantly. Most of them laughed. At the general store one July afternoon, a cattle rancher named Pete Lawson stood near the front counter, shaking his head toward the mountain. "Man's turning the whole hillside into a parking lot," Pete said. He was a big man, thick through the shoulders, with a voice that filled rooms whether he meant it to or not. His family had ranched in the valley for 3 generations, and he considered himself an authority on everything the mountains did or didn't do. A younger man named Miles Baxter, who ran the auto repair shop across the street, leaned against the counter and grinned. "Maybe he's building a landing strip." "Maybe he's just crazy," Pete replied. Laughter rolled through the small group gathered near the door. Behind the counter, a woman named Dorothy Fenn listened quietly. Dorothy had run the general store for nearly 20 years. She was small, sharp-eyed, and had the kind of patience that came from watching people say foolish things for a very long time. She said nothing. Malcolm Tate had come to Alderton 3 years earlier. He drove into town in a dusty pickup with Alberta plates, a duffel bag in the bed, and a Belgian Malinois riding shotgun. The dog's name was Boone. He was lean, sand-colored, with dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to track everything within 100 meters. Boone moved the way Malcolm moved. Quiet, purposeful, always watching. Malcolm was 63 years old. Tall, weathered, with close-cropped gray hair and deep lines etched around his eyes from decades of squinting into sun, sand, and wind. He had served 24 years in the Canadian Armed Forces. Infantry first, then combat engineering. 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Bosnia. He had built bridges under fire, cleared routes through minefields, and once pulled 2 wounded soldiers from a burning levee in Kandahar province, while shrapnel tore through the air around him. But he never talked about any of it. When he arrived in Alderton, he bought the old McPherson property on the plateau and started building. People expected a cabin, something rustic, appropriate. Instead, they watched a man methodically construct what looked like a fortress. The concrete walls were 30 centimeters thick, reinforced with steel rebar. The roof was standing seam metal, fireproof, with no exposed eaves where embers could collect. Every window had steel shutters that could be closed and latched from inside. The foundation included a buried water cistern holding nearly 20,000 liters, fed by a gravity system, connected to a mountain spring higher up the slope. Underground pipes connected the cistern to the sprinkler heads surrounding the property. A diesel-powered pump sat in a fireproof enclosure beside the house, ready to pressurize the entire system with the turn of a valve. Malcolm had cleared every tree, every shrub, every blade of dry grass within the 60-meter perimeter. The cleared zone was covered in gravel and low green ground cover that he watered regularly from the cistern. Nothing within that circle could burn. But the people of Alderton didn't see engineering. They saw destruction. "He's killing the mountain," Pete Lawson told anyone who would listen. "Cutting down healthy trees, digging up the ground. Man doesn't understand how things work out here." On warm evenings, when the regulars gathered at the Elkhorn pub on the main road, the conversation always drifted back to the plateau. Pete held court from his usual stool. "You know what his problem is?" he said one night, gesturing with his beer. "Too many years taking orders. Now he doesn't know what to do with himself, so he's playing soldier on the mountain." Miles laughed from across the bar, building fortifications against the trees. "Next thing you know, he'll be digging trenches," someone added. More laughter. The bartender, a skinny man named Curtis, shook his head and poured another round. Near the window, a woman sat alone. Her name was Rosalie Chen. She had moved to Alderton the previous autumn to teach at the elementary school. She was younger than most of the regulars, quiet, observant, and she had noticed something about Malcolm Tate that the others hadn't. The man wasn't afraid. He wasn't paranoid. He was working towards something with the kind of calm certainty that only came from experience. Rosalie had spoken to Malcolm once, at the general store. He had been buying diesel fuel and bulk water purification tablets. She asked him what he was building up there. He looked at her for a moment. "Something that'll still be standing when it matters," he said. Then he paid in cash and left. Before we go any further in this story, tell me something in the comments. Where are you watching from today? Your city, your province, your country? I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Up on the plateau, the summer heat pressed down on the valley like a weight. Malcolm stood at the edge of his cleared perimeter, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his glove. The chainsaw rested against a stump beside him. The last section of brush along the eastern slope had been cleared that morning. Boone sat nearby, watching the valley. The dog's ears rotated constantly, catching sounds that human ears couldn't detect. A hawk circling above the ridge, the distant hum of a truck on the highway, the faint crack of a dead branch somewhere deep in the forest. Malcolm crouched beside him and rested a hand on the dog's back. "That's the last of it," he said quietly. Boone glanced at him, then turned his gaze back toward the mountains to the north. Malcolm followed the dog's eyes. The northern slopes were thick with forest. Miles of dry timber, sun-baked brush, and dead fall that hadn't seen rain in weeks. The summer had been brutal. Hottest June on record, followed by a July with almost no precipitation. The creek beds running through the valley had dropped to a trickle. The forest floor crackled underfoot like paper. Malcolm had seen terrain like this before. Not here, but in the interior of BC during his training years. He knew what dry mountains looked like just before they burned. And he knew that most people didn't recognize the danger until the sky turned orange. That night, Malcolm sat on the porch of the house, watching the valley below. The lights of Alderton glowed faintly through the summer haze. Somewhere down there, Pete Lawson was probably telling another joke about the crazy soldier on the hill. Boone lay beside him, chin resting on his paws. But the dog wasn't sleeping. Every few minutes his nostrils flared as he tested the air. Malcolm noticed. "What do you smell, boy?" Boone lifted his head slightly, his eyes fixed on the dark ridge to the northwest, where the mountains disappeared into shadow. Malcolm looked that way for a long time. The air smelled different tonight. Drier, thinner, like something had been baked out of it. He pulled out his phone and checked the BC Wildfire Service dashboard. Several small fires were burning in the province, most of them far to the north. But one had been reported that afternoon near Invermere, less than 200 kilometers away. Lightning strike, no structures threatened, contained at 0.2 hectares. Malcolm studied the wind data. Prevailing winds from the northwest. Humidity dropping, temperature forecast to climb again by midweek. He set the phone down and looked at Boone. "We'll see," he said. Boone's ears flattened slightly. The dog gave a low, almost inaudible rumble in his chest. Down in Alderton, the Elkhorn pub was full. Laughter spilled out through the open windows and drifted up toward the mountains. Pete Lawson was buying a round. Curtis was wiping down the bar. Miles was arguing about hockey with a rancher named Tom. 3 days later, the wind changed. Malcolm felt it before he saw anything. He had been checking the sprinkler lines when a gust hit him from the northwest, hot and dry, carrying a smell he recognized instantly. Smoke, faint, distant, but unmistakable. Boone was already standing at the edge of the clearing, nose high, body rigid. Malcolm pulled out his phone. The fire near Invermere had grown. Dramatically, wind-driven spread overnight had pushed it to over 800 hectares. Another fire had sparked southeast of Golden. A third had been reported near Radium Hot Springs. The wind continued gusting from the northwest. Hot, dry, relentless. Malcolm checked the local weather. Extreme heat warning. Relative humidity below 15%. Wind gusts forecast to 40 kilometers per hour by evening. He walked to the pump enclosure and ran a full systems check. Fuel level, pressure gauges, sprinkler coverage, everything operational. He opened the cistern and checked the water level full. Nearly 20,000 liters waiting beneath the ground. Then he went inside and began pulling supplies from the storage room. Cases of bottled water, canned food, medical kits, blankets, batteries. He arranged everything along the main room in neat rows, the way he had once organized supply depots in Kandahar. Enough for 40 people, for days. Boone followed him through every room, watching, waiting. By late afternoon, a thin haze had settled over the valley. The sun turned a pale, sickly yellow. The air tasted like ash. Down in Alderton, people noticed. They stood in the street and looked toward the mountains. The haze was thickening. "Forest fire somewhere," Pete said outside the co-op, squinting at the sky. "Probably way up north." Dorothy Fenn stood in the doorway of her store. She wasn't looking north. She was looking up at the plateau, where Malcolm Tate's metal roof caught the fading light. That night, the sky turned orange. The fire that had started near Invermere had merged with 2 other blazes and jumped the ridgeline into the Purcell range. Driven by gusting winds, it was moving southeast through the valleys at a speed that stunned even the wildfire crews. Spot fires erupted kilometers ahead of the main front as burning embers sailed through the air like tiny meteors. By midnight, the BC Wildfire Service issued an evacuation alert for 3 communities in the East Kootenay. Alderton was not yet on the list. By 2 in the morning, it was. The sound that woke the town was not a siren. It was the wind. A roaring, furnace-hot wind that ripped through the valley and rattled every window in every house. The power went out at 2:17 a.m. The cell tower followed minutes later. Malcolm was already awake. He stood at the window of his house, watching the northwestern sky. The horizon glowed a deep, pulsing orange, like sunrise in the wrong direction. Embers floated through the air above the tree line, carried on the wind like fireflies from hell. Boone stood beside him. The dog's body was tense, ears forward, every muscle ready. "Here it comes," Malcolm said. He moved to the pump enclosure and started the diesel engine. The pump roared to life. Within seconds, water surged through the buried pipes, and the sprinkler heads around the property erupted in wide arcs, drenching the gravel perimeter, the walls of the house, the metal roof. A fine mist hung in the air around the entire structure. Malcolm closed the steel shutters on every window, sealed the vents, and checked the interior air supply. The house became a sealed shelter, surrounded by a ring of water and bare ground. Then he waited. Down in Alderton, panic had already begun. People stumbled out of their houses in the dark, choking on smoke. The air was thick with ash. Visibility had dropped to almost nothing. The road out of town, the only road, was blocked where a burning tree had fallen across the highway 3 kilometers south. Families gathered in the street, clutching children and bags. Dogs barked. Someone was crying. The heat was growing, and the orange glow above the mountains was spreading. Pete Lawson stood outside his house in his boots and undershirt, staring at the fire line advancing along the ridge. For the first time in his life, he had nothing to say. Miles ran toward the highway and came back minutes later, coughing. Roads blocked, trees down. We can't get out. Dorothy Fenn stood on the porch of her store, looking up at the mountain. Through the smoke and ash, she could see something impossible. Water. A fine spray of water catching the orange glow, shimmering around a structure on the plateau like a halo. Up there, she said. Her voice was calm. We go up there. Pete looked at her. You mean to Tate's place? I mean to the only building in this valley that was built for this. For a long moment, no one moved. The fire crackled louder on the ridge. Embers rained down onto rooftops. A fence post at the edge of town caught fire. Miles stepped forward. She's right. Rosalie appeared from the school, carrying 2 small children she had pulled from a neighbor's house. We need to move now. They moved. 23 people climbed the trail toward the plateau in the dark, through smoke so thick they could barely see the person ahead of them. The heat intensified as they climbed. Burning embers swirled through the air, landing on clothing and hair. Pete carried an elderly woman named Gladys on his back. Dorothy held the hand of a boy who couldn't stop coughing. Rosalie kept the 2 small children pressed against her chest. Halfway up the trail, the fire reached the edge of the forest below them. Trees exploded into flame with a sound like cannon shots. The heat hit them in waves. A young mother near the back of the group stumbled and fell. Her daughter, a girl no more than 5, tumbled down the slope into the thick brush beside the trail. Lily, the mother screamed. The smoke swallowed everything. People shouted. Miles dropped to his knees and crawled toward the brush, but the heat pushed him back. Then a shape burst through the smoke. Low, fast, silent. Boone. The Malinois had come down the trail from the plateau. The dog moved through the burning brush without hesitation, nose to the ground, tracking the child's scent through the chaos. Seconds later, he found her. The girl was curled beneath a fallen log, coughing, barely conscious. Boone gripped the back of her jacket gently in his teeth and pulled. The child slid free from the brush. The dog dragged her uphill, step by step, through smoke and falling embers, until Miles reached them and lifted the girl into his arms. Boone stood there for a moment, panting hard. His left side was singed. Dark patches of burnt fur ran along his flank where embers had landed. He limped slightly on his front paw, where the rocky ground had torn the pad open. But he turned back toward the plateau and started walking again. Follow the dog, Dorothy said. They followed. When they reached the top of the trail, the plateau opened before them like another world. The sprinklers were running at full pressure, throwing arcs of water across the gravel perimeter. The mist caught the orange glow of the fire and turned it into something almost beautiful. The house sat at the center of the cleared zone, untouched, its metal roof gleaming wet. Malcolm Tate stood at the front door. He had watched them coming up the trail. He had seen Boone disappear into the smoke and come back with the child. He had seen everything. He held the door open. Get inside, he said. One by one, they stumbled through the doorway. The air inside was clean. The concrete walls blocked the heat. The temperature inside was 20 degrees cooler than the inferno raging beyond the perimeter. People collapsed against the walls. Children cried and then went quiet as the shock set in. The young mother held Lily so tightly the girl squirmed. Pete Lawson stood in the middle of the room looking around. The supply shelves, the medical kits, the water containers, the ventilation system. Everything organized, everything. Ready. He opened his mouth and closed it again. Malcolm knelt beside Boone near the door. The dog's flank was raw in places. The fur burned away to pink skin beneath. His front paw left bloody prints on the concrete floor. Easy, partner, Malcolm murmured. He pulled a medical kit from beneath a bench and began cleaning the wounds with steady hands. Boone sat perfectly still, watching Malcolm's face the entire time. Rosalie crouched nearby. He saved that little girl. Malcolm didn't look up. That's what he does. The fire roared outside. Through the sealed vents, they could hear the sound of trees exploding on the slopes below. The windows behind the steel shutters glowed faintly orange. The sprinklers continued running, the pump throbbing steadily in its enclosure. But inside the house, it was quiet, safe. The walls held. Malcolm stood and looked across the room. 23 faces looked back at him, lit by the warm glow of a battery-powered lantern. "We're going to be here a while," he said. "Storm's not done yet." Pete cleared his throat. "How long?" Malcolm checked the pressure gauge beside the ventilation intake. "The fire front will pass through the valley by morning, but the heat and smoke could stay for 2, maybe 3 days before it's safe to go back down." "And this place can handle that?" Miles asked. Malcolm gave a small shrug. "That's what I built it for." He began passing out water bottles and blankets. "Everyone drinks first, then we rest in shifts." The quiet authority in his voice settled over the room like a blanket itself. These were instructions from a man who had kept people alive in far worse places than this. Hours passed. The fire outside reached its peak around 4 in the morning. The sound was overwhelming, a deep, sustained roar that seemed to come from every direction at once. The temperature outside the perimeter exceeded 700 degrees as the crown fire swept through the forest canopy. Trees that had stood for 100 years were consumed in seconds. But the cleared zone held. The sprinkler's perimeter refused to burn. The metal roof shed embers like rain off a windshield. And inside the concrete walls, 23 people from Alderton breathed clean air and waited. Boone rested beside the door, his injured side bandaged, his eyes never fully closing. Even wounded, the dog watched. Guarded, the way he always had, through training, through deployment, through the quiet years on the mountain, with the man who had given him a home after the military was done with both of them. Around dawn, the roar began to fade. The fire had moved southeast, consuming the dry forest ahead of it, but leaving the plateau untouched. The orange glow outside the shutters dimmed. The air pressure slowly stabilized. Malcolm opened one shutter a few centimeters and looked out. The valley below was transformed. Blackened trees stood like charcoal skeletons across the slopes. Smoke drifted through the ruins. Several structures in the town were gone. But some still stood, protected by luck or by stone foundations that resisted the worst of the heat. He closed the shutter and turned back to the room. "Fires moved past us," he said. "But we stay put until the smoke clears." Nobody argued. For 2 days, the people of Alderton lived inside Malcolm Tate's house on the plateau. They ate from his supply shelves. They drank his water. They slept on cots he pulled from a storage room. Most of them didn't know existed. And slowly, the room changed. Pete Lawson, the man who had mocked Malcolm for months, spent hours sitting near the ventilation gauge, asking quiet questions about how the system worked. Miles helped Malcolm maintain the sprinkler lines during brief trips outside. Dorothy organized the food distribution with the same efficiency she ran her store. Rosalie kept the children calm with stories and songs. And Boone, bandaged and limping, moved slowly through the room, checking on everyone, the way a patrol dog checks a perimeter. He rested his head against the little girl Lily's lap, and she stroked his ears until she fell asleep. On the 3rd morning, Malcolm opened the steel door. Sunlight poured in, hazy but real. The air still smelled of smoke, but the heat had broken. Beyond the wet gravel perimeter, the burned forest stretched down the valley in every direction. Alderton looked smaller from up here, wounded, but still there. Pete stepped outside first. His boots crunched on the gravel. He stood for a long moment, staring at the devastation below. Then he turned around and looked at Malcolm. "I owe you an apology," Pete said. His voice was quieter than anyone had ever heard it. Malcolm said nothing. "I called this place every name I could think of," Pete continued. He looked at the concrete walls, the metal roof, the sprinkler heads still dripping. "Called you crazy for cutting those trees." He swallowed. "Turns out you were the only one who understood what this mountain could do." Malcolm looked down the valley. "I didn't cut those trees because I was afraid of them. I cut them so this place could protect people when time stepped forward. And it did." Rosalie held Lily's hand. The little girl looked up at Malcolm with wide eyes. "Your dog saved me," she said. Malcolm looked at Boone, who stood in the doorway, weight off his injured paw, watching the valley with the same calm alertness he always carried. "He's been saving people his whole life," Malcolm said quietly. They spent the rest of the day clearing a path down to the town. The fire crews arrived by helicopter that afternoon. The evacuation order was lifted 2 days later. And in the weeks that followed, as the people of Alderton rebuilt fences, repaired roofs, and replanted what the fire had taken, every conversation eventually circled back to the same place: the house on the plateau. Pete Lawson drove up the mountain the following weekend with a truck full of lumber. He spent 3 days helping Malcolm repair the sections of perimeter fencing that had warped in the heat. They worked mostly in silence. Pete wasn't a man comfortable with gratitude, but the work said what his words couldn't. On the last afternoon, Pete leaned against the truck and looked out across the valley. "Town council's talking about adopting your design," he said. "Fire-safe perimeters, sprinkler systems, concrete safe rooms." Malcolm tightened a bolt on the fence post. "Good idea." Pete shook his head with a small laugh. "You really are something, Tate." The BC Wildfire Service later reported that the fire had burned over 12,000 hectares across the East Kootenay. 17 structures were destroyed. But in Alderton, every person survived, because one man had been ready. Years passed, the forest slowly recovered. Green shoots pushed through blackened soil. Aspens and willows reclaimed the lower slopes. The valley healed the way valleys do, quietly, season by season. Malcolm Tate grew older on the plateau. His hair went fully white. His shoulders, once broad enough to carry wounded soldiers, settled into the slower posture of a man at peace with the years behind him. But he still checked the sprinkler lines every spring, still cleared the perimeter every summer, still watched the sky when the wind came from the northwest. And Boone aged beside him. The Malinois' muzzle turned silver. His stride slowed, but his eyes never changed. Dark, intelligent, watchful. The two of them could be seen most evenings sitting on the porch together, looking out over the valley as the sun dropped behind the Purcells. When Malcolm Tate passed away one quiet October morning, the news moved through the valley the way wind moves through trees. Alderton closed its doors for the day. Ranchers left their fields. Families drove up the winding road to the plateau. They gathered beside the house Malcolm had built with his own hands. Many of them brought their children, because this was a story that deserved to be remembered. Pete Lawson, gray-haired now himself, stood near the front and cleared his throat. "When Malcolm first came here," he said, "we thought he was out of his mind." A few people smiled softly. Pete shook his head. Turns out he was the only one paying attention. Beside the house, beneath a tall surviving Douglas fir that had stood just inside the perimeter, a simple stone marker had been placed. Malcolm Tate, protector of the valley. And next to it, a small bronze statue, a Belgian Malinois standing alert, ears forward, watching the valley below. Pete rested his hand on the statue as he passed. "Good dog," he whispered. The wind moved softly through the recovering forest. High above the valley, the house on the plateau still stood strong against the mountain sky. And every summer, when the air grew dry and the wind carried the faint smell of distant smoke, the people of Alderton remembered something Malcolm Tate had once told them. People don't prepare because they are afraid. They prepare so that when the worst comes, they can hold the door open for someone else. Before you go, I want to ask you something simple. If you believe loyalty like Boone's still exists in this world, type 1 in the comments. If you think more people should prepare to protect others the way Malcolm did, type 0. Just a 1 or a 0. I read every single comment, and I'd love to hear what you think. And if this story moved you, take a second to subscribe to the channel, because the next story we share might be even more powerful. Another true kind of hero story about courage, loyalty, and the unbreakable bond between a veteran and the dog who never left his side. Until next time, stay safe out there.